let's talk about the books I read in January. Hey all, it's Darcy, and today we are doing my January wrap-up. I read, I believe, 8 books, so we're going to go through those. There's a mix of genres, a mix of fiction and non-fiction this time around, because I have kind of set out that for myself that I do want to read more non-fiction this year, and so I've definitely gotten a good start on that, because I said the same thing last year and did not do it, but we're going better already. I feel like what I want for my reading this year is a lot more chill, because last year I had that goal of 100 books that I was really pushing for, but I have a lot of other things in my life and interests and things that I want to prioritize more this year. I'm really trying to prioritize art more and get into kind of selling my art and things like that. So I think I set my Goodreads goal for 50 maybe, or maybe even less than that. Because yeah, reading just like isn't my main priority this year, but I'm still obviously gonna read a bunch. I did read a bunch in January. So we're going to talk about those books. It was a pretty busy month. You know, I'm on holidays in January. I went on a road trip, which you can see that video. You know, I had a bunch of little catch-ups, friends, family, and various things going on. And it was a pretty good month overall. But we're here to talk about the books, so let's do that. The very first book I read in January was The Roommate Pact by Allison Ashley. This book was sent to me by the publisher, but this is one of the books I took on my road trip with me. I read it while I was away. This is a romance about a nurse and a fireman who are roommates, obviously, and the pact part comes in because they kind of had this pact that if they're both single by 40, they're going to become friends with benefits, but then their timeline kind of changes when this guy gets into an accident and the other part of our pair ends up kind of taking care of him because he's bedridden. And I admit that I do sometimes have a weakness for those kind of stories, those romances where one character is taking care of another, so I did like that aspect. I also really enjoyed the banter between these two characters, and I did enjoy this book overall, although there were definitely things that I didn't love. The very beginning of this book made me want to put it down because kind of the tone it was taking, and I don't know if it was, the start of it was supposed to be funny, but it just wasn't jiving with me. The start of this book was not jiving with me at all, and I also felt like the way the pact came about just felt like very awkward. But once we kind of got past the start, I did, for the most part, enjoy the rest of the book. So I think I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 overall, because I do primarily rate on enjoyment. So it wasn't a bad way to start. The other book I took away with me was Home Before Dark by Riley Sager. This was my first book club read of the year. I haven't really put an announcement out here or anything, but I am hosting a book club in my Discord this year, so feel free to join us. This was our January read. In February, we are reading Nettle and Bone. So it's going to be kind of a mix of like thriller and horror, and then like fantasy and sci-fi is kind of where the vibe's going to be at. So this is a thriller. This was our first read, and this follows a woman who is returning to her childhood home, and the story has always gone, and what her parents have always said, and they were in the news for even, and things like that, is that the reason her family evacuated this house when they had not lived there for very long was because it was haunted. And this woman, I can never remember any characters' names. Maggie. Maggie has never believed this. So when her father dies and she inherits this house, she returns there, one, to kind of fix the house up to sell, but also because she wants to find out the truth of why her family suddenly left this house in the middle of the night. And I found this book really interesting, particularly because of the kind of the dual stories we were getting. So some of the book is told like in present day Maggie as an adult, and then you also get snippets of a book that her father wrote, because her father wrote a book about their experiences in this house and the fact it was haunted and the fact they had to flee and all of those kind of things. So you get snippets of his book as well as like Maggie's current day story. And I found that really interesting and definitely helped keep my engagement, especially since Maggie as a character I didn't love, especially because she spends a good portion of this book just constantly saying over and over, my parents are liars, I can't believe anything they say, they're liars, they're such liars. And it was getting a little, you know, getting a little overdone at some points, but the fact that there were those snippets of the other book really helped to keep my engagement in this story. And I definitely called a number of the things that were kind of revealed by the end, but it didn't really hinder my enjoyment overall. And so yeah, I gave this one a 4 out of 5 as well, so it was not a bad start to the book club. Another book club read, but this one was for Melbourne Bookish Book Club, and that was One of Us is Lying by Karen M. McManus. This is a YA mystery, thriller, mystery, however this is categorized. It's very much like Breakfast Club meets Gossip Girl, or even like Pretty Little Liars. That's the kind of vibe that's going on here, because you have these 5 students, I think there were 5 students, who are in detention, and one of them dies. So now they're trying to find out what really happened, who's actually responsible, and all of that kind of stuff. And also the boy who died was actually also in control of a kind of gossip site where he, you know, posted all this information about other students at the school that they didn't necessarily want to get out and all of that kind of stuff, which is why I say it's got that hint of like a Gossip Girl vibe in that respect. But I unfortunately did not love this one. I think I am finding more and more that for the most part, there are some exceptions, but for the most part, the only YA I really like is fantasy. It wasn't only the fact that it was a YA that made me struggle with this, because obviously like that can have a certain writing style and stuff to it, and the fact it being set in a school and all that kind of stuff I don't love. But that wasn't really necessarily my problem overall, although it did contribute to the fact I found this boring. Like if this wasn't a book club read, if this wasn't a book I physically owned because I got it in a book swap at one point, I probably wouldn't have been as motivated to finish it, although I was like curious as to how it would turn out, but again, kind of called some of what was happening here in this book as well. But I don't know, there was just a lot of things that just felt silly or not quite right, especially when it came to some of the motivations in this book and the way that it was kind of treating mental health, or the, like, I don't know, the ending of this book kind of just made me uncomfortable. I just don't love how it was done. As I said, I kind of called who I thought was responsible, but the reasonings behind it and the fact that a number of people just kind of went along with it, and the way it was tied to certain things. Like I can't really talk about it explicitly without going to full spoilers, but I didn't love what was going on there. But even before that, like I was mostly just kind of bored in this book. Like I thought the relationship was actually the one thing where I was like, oh, there were actually some cute moments there. One of the main relationships that happened in this book. But outside of that, I was pretty bored. And then I didn't love how things wrapped up at the end, which made things even worse because of, you know, potentially problematic content in some respects. So yeah, unfortunately was not a fan of this one. The last physical book I have to show, which, you know, half of the books I have to show you are actually physical books that I own, slash in this case that Nathan owns, which usually isn't the case. I rarely have a lot of physical books to show, but I'm really trying to make an effort this year to read down more of my physical TBR. But the other physical thing I read was Middle-earth Strategy Battle Game Rules Manual. Yes, it's a rules book, but I'm showing this off as something I read because I did read this in one sitting. It's like, it is hundreds of pages long. It's like 200 and something pages, and I read it all in one sitting, so I'm still going to count it towards my reading goal. But yeah, it's a rule book to a tabletop game with miniatures that battle and stuff. It's the game that's like taken over Nathan's life basically, and so he had a games night with people over playing it, so I decided to read the rulebook while they were playing the game. I have since played one game and I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued, but yeah, that's the story with this one. So a rulebook, very exciting, but you know. Alright, my last 4 reads were 2 ebooks and 2 audiobooks. these aren't technically the only things that I read in January. These are just the only things I finished in January, because I'm technically in the middle of a lot of things. But in terms of what I finished, another thing I read was Blood Moon by Jillian Graves, which is a monster romance. This is between a witch and a vampire, I want to say. This might give you some indication that it wasn't the most memorable one I've ever read. I think I gave this one 3 stars. It was like fine. It was an enjoyable enough little read, but also like the relationship progressed so fast. And I don't just mean on like an, you know, intimacy level kind of thing, which you can kind of expect in a short monster romance, but like the way they were so quickly professing each other's love to each other, and the way that like one of these characters was ready to like give up his whole life's dream or his everything he'd worked for that point, like for her basically. I don't know, it just felt a bit weird and rushed in a few of those respects, but it was kind of cute. It was, I don't regret reading it. I don't remember if it said it was enemies to lovers or at least rivals to lovers, but even rivals to lovers it wasn't really, because while technically yes they were like competing business owners, there was like no rivalry from the very beginning. So we're gonna take that off the table, but this was fine. I listened to Blood, Sweat and Pixels, which was one of my non-fiction reads, and this is all kind of about the gaming industry and kind of behind the scenes of a bunch of big games. So it looks at like The Witcher 3, Stardew Valley, Destiny might have been one of them. I don't know, it looked at a bunch of games and talked about behind the scenes and like the experience of the companies and the game devs and all of those kind of things. I found this really interesting. I did really like this. I think to an extent it probably glosses over some of the problems within the industry maybe a little bit, because it kind of mentioned a number of times about things like the crunch of making video games and basically how overworked everyone is at the end, but it kind of glossed over it like, well, that's just what you have to do to make good games. And I feel like there's probably something deeper going on there, right? But it was still really interesting to learn more about these games, especially because a number of the ones that it talked about I have played, and there was things like, you know, learning about how Stardew Valley was basically just one guy's pet project that he made at home, and then it suddenly exploded into this super popular thing when he put it on Steam and all of that kind of stuff. Like, it was really interesting. I really liked learning more about the behind the scenes of some of these things that I have. Also listened to The Psychology of Final Fantasy, which was my other non-fiction. This is obviously looking at the Final Fantasy franchise, which is video games, but in this time kind of looking at them through the lens of psychology, although how much some of the things in this was actually doing that, I'm not sure. A lot of the little, I guess they were essays, a lot of the ones in here kind of just felt like a retelling of the plot more so than analysing it any deeper. And I also found that between them, even when they were talking about the same game, there were inconsistencies. Now, I haven't played every single Final Fantasy, though I have played a number of them. So some of the games they were talking about, I couldn't necessarily comment exactly on the accuracy. But if there are conflicting facts about the same game between them, then obviously someone's got to be wrong. And I did see other reviews talking about how so much of what they said was kind of wrong. And there were a number of things that I picked up on, that I did pick up on, that wasn't even necessarily just like story facts, but like overarching ideas about the franchise that they put forward that was kind of wrong. So you may get the idea here that I really didn't like this. I respect that this exists, and I do really like that there is so much of this type of media out there where people do analyze franchises on a deeper level and stuff. I've read a number of the like philosophy books that are looking at different franchises and things like that. But yeah, I just was not really satisfied with this one in particular. And on top of that, I was listening to an audiobook, and it was not a good audiobook. Like, there were so many like long pauses between sentences and things like that that just made this difficult to read. And I listen to things on a, you know, sped up So if I'm listening to something sped up and there's still a huge pause, how long was that pause actually? So yeah, didn't love it, but it's the thing I listened to, and now we can move on. Lastly, my favorite read of the month was Godkiller by Hannah Kana, is it? I am terrible with knowing how to pronounce people's names, but I did read Godkiller, which is an adult fantasy. I need to read more adult fantasy. I feel like, although this one probably not as much, but a lot of adult fantasy is so huge that I often get intimidated by the fact that fantasy are so often just like longer than every other book. But I need to get over that because I find that so often when I do read adult fantasy, they're like my favorite things. But this is following this little kind of unlikely group that ends up together because you have a child who's lost her mother, you have a god killer, so someone whose job is literally to go out and kill gods, and then another man on his own personal quest who joins along too. And so they've all kind of got their own personal motivations, and you also have the child who has a god connected to her, and there's a whole thing with that, and definitely had very mixed feelings about that god. He definitely made me mad at some points. But yeah, and this whole world's really interesting in the fact that obviously there are gods, but there are god killers because we've gotten to a point where the gods are no longer trusted, and so it's kind of outlawed to worship them, and they're trying to get rid of them basically. So that's kind of the setup of the world, but then you've got obviously these characters that are connected to gods in various ways, and they have kind of their own personal quests that they're trying to go on and the things they're trying to accomplish, and you're seeing how their stories kind of interweave on this kind of little quest story. And yeah, I really enjoyed this, and I'm definitely interested to see where this goes because the sequel does come out this year. Although, yeah, I don't know that I like fell in love with any of the characters necessarily. Most of them made questionable choices at one time or another, but we'll see how that plays out as we go forward, since it is just the first book in a series. But I did really enjoy it, and this was my 5-star for the month because it's not something that's jumping straight up to like an all-time favorite for me personally, but it is something I really enjoyed at the time that I don't have fault with. So yeah, that's everything that I read in January. I would love to hear what was your favorite thing you read in January, or if you have read any of these books, what you thought of them. And otherwise, I am going to endeavor to actually upload regular wrap-ups here. I'm pretty proud of myself that so far this year I have actually uploaded weekly. I have been uploading every weekend. So, you know, I know my videos don't always end up in people's subscription feeds. So if you see this one and think, oh, I haven't really been seeing her videos, or in the future think, oh, I'm not really seeing videos from her, I mean, it's possible. It's possible that I just stop uploading again. But if we stay on this track, then I'll be uploading once a week, and you can check for those. Yeah, so hopefully there will be more regular wrap-ups, and this will not be the only one I post this year, unlike last year. That being said, I'm gonna go now. Tutti Fen and Stasi out.